To the casual observer, I'm sure that the sugar mills look like the most impressive part of Taiwan's economy. They were huge, they were modern, they were filled with sophisticated equipment. Now, they were by far the most important capital investment Japanese corporations were making into the Taiwan economy. They were producing Taiwan's most important export good, sugar, and that was the most important good not just in the Japanese time, but as late as the 1950s. But what really was the effect of the sugar mills on Taiwan's economic development? I'm going to argue that these mills, they weren't really exploitive or oppressive, at least as far as the Taiwanese were concerned. But they weren't really adding all that much to Taiwan's economic development. They were probably creating some good infrastructure, okay, which later would be useful to Taiwan. But they were part of an enclave economy. It was a part of the Taiwan economy controlled by the Japanese that really didn't have a lot of connection with the rest of Taiwan's economy. What's most important, though, is that this sugar was no longer really Taiwan's comparative advantage in the world economy. There was other places out there like Java and Cuba that could make sugar better and cheaper. So this investment was misinvestment. Now it's misinvestment coming out of Japanese funds, but it still is misinvestment that's kind of leading Taiwan down the wrong track. That's what I want to focus on in this section. Before I go there, though, I first want to show you what these mills actually look like. This is Chaozhou Sugar Mill. This is where the modern sugar industry in Taiwan began. And I think you should come down and visit it someday if you have a chance. I'm going to take you and take a look at a few places here in the mill. Okay. But this was very clearly a Japanese government project. They decided they wanted to turn Taiwan into their sugar island. They looked around. They finally got Mitsui, the big Japanese conglomerate, to come in and invest. They brought in a few more Japanese investors. There was a handful of Taiwanese investors like Chen Zhonghe as well. But this was very clearly a Japanese-owned and controlled project. It was run by Japanese technicians. Okay, let's go in. They bring the sugar cane into this first room. They have to shred it. You can't see the shredder very well. But then they put it into the presser. And this is the presser. It presses the shredded sugar cane. It presses out the juices. Over here, we see the evaporation tanks. Once you crush the juices out of the sugar cane, you gotta heat it up and evaporate the water. So you're just left with the sugar. And over here, higher up on the pink tanks up here, those are the crystallization chambers. And that's where they kind of roll the sugar around once the water's been evaporated so that the sugar will form into crystals. Okay, there's a lot more to see here at the Chaozhou Sugar Mill. I want to just give you an idea of what these factories look like. One of the reasons I'm here at Chaozhou is this is the easiest place to get to. You go to Kaohsiung, you take the MRT line up to kind of its northern end, and you're right here. This is the beginning of the modern sugar industry in Taiwan. So that's what a sugar mill looks like. It's a big modern factory, and it's located out in the countryside among poor villages. And it's become a symbol of imperialist exploitation. And you can see why. It's this big monster out there belching smoke. Feed me, feed me, feed me. And then there's the poor villagers living all around that have to come out and slave away in the hot tropical sun, slashing sugar cane, harvesting the cane, and sending it to the factory, to feed the beast. So the beast can produce sugar so that people back in the imperialist center can eat ice cream and candy and cake. Okay? So these sugar mills do not have good reputations. Another problem with the sugar industry is it is very hard work, and it was hard to find free labor that would do this type of work in tropical conditions. So most sugar mills early on used slaves. Okay, so this was most the black slavery in the Americas was tied to sugar. And then after the slaves were freed, they couldn't hardly get free people to come back in and work in these areas to produce sugar. They ended up signing up indentured servants, often Asians. Many of them were from India. They would come to the Caribbean. They would have to sign long-term contracts, maybe 5 or 7 years. And then for that period of time, they couldn't quit. They had to work on these plantations. You know, they lived in plantation villages. Everything was run by the boss, and you know, he could be very exploitive. The sugar mill also becomes a symbol for wealth inequality, because to get all that sugar cane, it often invested in big spreads of land, and the peasants living around there would have very little land, and then you had this sugar mill that, you know, owned maybe half of all the land around, okay, to grow its sugar cane. Sugar mills also were often tied to crony capitalism. Crony capitalism is capitalism, but the difference between regular capitalism and crony capitalism is that crony capitalists make large investments in political connections. Okay, so they're going to make a lot of their profits depending upon how good their connections are with politicians and with the people who run the government. And if you're going to make these investments in faraway places, and they're big capital investments, you want security. Usually you do invest a lot of time in getting good relations with the government. And in the beginning, this might be kind of a defensive relationship. You want to make sure that, you know, the government doesn't stab you in the back, that it doesn't raise taxes or do anything that's going to harm your business, which you've invested so much money in. But eventually, sometimes these relationships become kind of offensive. You know, the businessman uses his position with the government to try to stop competition from other people and try to get more control over the labor force. Maybe find ways to unfairly, get more land. Okay? So this is a capitalism, but it's often a crony capitalism. And the sugar mills, they often form cartels, and when they sell their goods back to the imperialist center, okay, the big profits they make usually remain in the imperialist center, because that's where the capitalists are that made the investment in the mill. Okay, so sometimes the mills make big profits, but the profits don't go to the colony. The profits go to the people who invested. Okay, and they're living back in the imperial power. Taiwan's reality was somewhat different. Okay? I don't see any increase in poverty due to Taiwan's sugar mills. In fact, the sort of evidence I've seen suggests that there may have been some small increase in economic welfare when a sugar mill moved into an area. Okay, so I don't think that's really a problem in Taiwan. Taiwan's sugar mills always used free labor. The people had other jobs they could do. Okay, they were usually not forced to produce sugar. I think wages were market wages. I don't see much exploitation along this line. And in Taiwan, the sugar cane, sometimes it would come from plantations, particularly after World War I. The sugar mills in Taiwan started gathering more and more land. Sometimes they put together a large plantation. Most of the time, the sugar cane came from small farms. Sometimes these were small farms owned by small farmers. Sometimes the small farms were from rented land, and it might be rented from the sugar cane, from the sugar mill. But these were independent producers. Okay, they weren't gang laborers who were slaves or indentured servants. And when the sugar mills moved into an area, they brought a lot of infrastructure because they needed to get the cane to the sugar mill fast. They often built light rail systems. These light rail systems could be used for other things, and people used them to, go into town and shop. Okay, maybe they could go into town and find a better school for their children. Maybe some people in the family could use the light rail to go in and find work in another area. Okay, so I think that all in all, the sugar mills moving into an area, that wasn't bad for Taiwanese. Now, the sugar mills were a form of crony capitalism. And in this case, what happens is that the Mitsui, Mitsubishi, the big conglomerates that invested in these sugar mills, they wanted to make sure they could make big profits. Okay. They influenced the government so that the government would put up a tariff wall around the Japanese empire, and then they could charge a they could charge and get large monopoly profits. Okay. They charged the Japanese consumer much more for the sugar than it cost them to produce in Taiwan. Okay. And so this was a way that the businessmen, they were investing in in political connections, and they made lots of money through this investment. And the cartel profits went overseas. And I think we can see this when we look at Taiwan's trade. Okay. We focus in on this. This is Taiwan's imports and exports. The exports are black, the imports are red. What you can see is that in the Japanese period, that's the kind of the first part of the graph before World War II, except for one particular year, exports were always greater than imports. Often they were quite a bit bigger than imports. Okay. This is a trade surplus. And a trade surplus is often thought of as a good thing. But for a colony, it's not necessarily a good thing. It means that more is being taken out of the colony than is being brought back in. Okay, that could show exploitation. In this case, I think it shows exploitation, but of Japanese consumers. My understanding of what's happening here is that the sugar exports from Taiwan are being priced, the price they expect to be able to, what they're going to be sold for in Japan, this higher price. And so it looks like the sugar being exported from Taiwan is very, is worth a lot. And it is worth a lot to the company. But the money they actually spend producing the sugar in Taiwan is quite small. So the profits are all staying in Japan, and they never get into Taiwan. Okay? So I think that actually these extra high exports are kind of a little bit fake. They're mainly just the monopoly profits that the sugar cartel that's been set up in Taiwan is squeezing from Japanese consumers. So this is a form of exploitation, but I don't think they were exploiting the Taiwanese. Sometimes when you think of imperialism, you tend to think, well, it's going to be an imperial power exploiting a colony. Well, I think this goes back to, I can't remember which was, some bank robber once was asked, why do you rob banks? He said, ooh, no, that's where the money is. So of course I'm going to rob banks. Okay. Well, it's a little bit the same here. If you're an imperial power, you might think, well, they're going to kind of loot that colony. But really, colonies are often pretty poor. Sometimes there's not a lot to loot. Okay? So the richer areas where you can loot are places like the consumers in your own country. And so often you do find that colonies are used, okay, to gain unfair advantage in your own domestic market. Okay, so this was what the Japanese companies did. They went in, they got government support to set up these big sugar mills. Okay, but they told the government, well, you're going to have to give us some protection here. And they got really good protection, and they stayed in good with the government. And the Japanese consumers paid much more for sugar than they would have paid in a free market. Now, the Japanese hold on to Taiwan until 1945. Okay, the sugar trade probably lasts about 1941 or so. Okay, and then it becomes kind of dangerous to bring much sugar into Japan. When the KMT takes over Taiwan in 1945, 1945 to 1949, Taiwan and China are united. Okay? And KMT is running both of them. Now, they have to decide what to do with this sugar industry. Now, when you look at things like the sugar mills, okay, you see a lot of these things in ex-colonies. There are kind of enclave economies. There are parts of the economy that are controlled by the imperial power. They're often capital intensive because the imperial power has a lot of capital, okay? But they're kind of cut off from the rest of the economy. And the sugar mills were kind of cut off from most of the Taiwanese economy, okay? They were making their own money and their own capital, okay? The Japanese businesses didn't mix much with the Taiwanese businessmen, okay? So you have this enclave, and it's capital intense. Now, when the colony gets its independence, and it sees these big mills or whatever the imperialist countries have built in their country, often they see these as very valuable things. Okay, this was something that the Western powers of the Japanese invested in our country, and now we've got it. Okay, and it's a big, expensive thing. And these mills, they were big and they were expensive. Okay, sometimes these are treated kind of as the crown jewels of the new country. And the country puts a lot of effort and money into trying to protect and build its economy around these big mills or whatever it is. This isn't. I mean, this is a problem though. Okay, and the problem is that these big sugar mills or whatever made sense when the colony belonged to an imperial power, because the imperial power could get cheap capital, and these were capital-intensive projects that needed capital to be maintained. Once the colony becomes independent, it often has a very hard time getting capital. And then what happens is how is it going to keep up these giant sugar mills? Okay? And maybe they can keep up the sugar mills, but they put too much capital in there and it sucks capital out of the rest of the country. So sometimes people think of these sugar mills or whatever it is as white elephants. I don't know if you know the story of the white elephant, but the story is it's supposed to be something the Thai king would do. A white elephant was a noble beast, but it was very expensive to raise. It had to be treated royally. If it happened to die on you, it would make you look really bad. Maybe the king would punish you. Okay? So sometimes if a noble was getting too rich, the king would invite him in and give him a present. They would give him a white elephant. And the white elephant looks wonderful. It looks like the king is really honoring you. But the king knows that, this is maybe going to bankrupt you, trying to raise this white elephant the way it should be raised. So when we talk about white elephants in English, we're talking about things that look really impressive, really important, but actually they cost more than they're worth. And the sugar mills, I think, were really more white elephants. Okay, once the Japanese left and the Japanese market was no longer open to Taiwan, okay, these sugar mills really couldn't make enough money to cover their expenses. What happens, though, is from 1945 to 1949, when Taiwan is united with China, the Chinese felt that Japan had used Taiwan as a sugar island. China could also use Taiwan as a sugar island. And so with American aid, they went in and rebuilt these sugar mills. And it cost a lot. After 1949, when they lose the mainland, then they find that they don't really have a good market for sugar out there anymore. Okay, the free market for sugar was a mess back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. It was most big sugar consumers, they already had special contracts with their ex-colonies to get sugar. So the Taiwanese were in a situation where they had already sunk a lot of money. The Taiwanese government now, after 1949, has sunk a lot of money into the sugar mills. Some of it was American money. That was good for them. But now the sugar industry is having trouble. They're not making the profits they expected. So, to me, I see these sugar mills as becoming part of an enclave economy that now it no longer makes any sense. If you go back and you look at the metric tons of sugar produced, you can see that, in the late 1940s, they did come in, they rebuilt the sugar mills. These sugar mills had been bombed because they were producing alcohol that was used for Japanese aviation. But with American help, they're rebuilt. By the time they're rebuilt, the Chinese have lost the mainland. Now they have to find ways to sell their sugar. They can't sell it at a very good price on the international market. But they've already built the sugar mills, so they keep using them. One of the interesting things about these sugar mills, you can go today, look at the one like at Chaozhou, and they look almost exactly the same as they looked when the Japanese built them. If you look at the old Japanese pictures and then you look at them today, it's the same. And what this shows you is that the KMT basically discovered, the KMT government, is that, we've built these mills, we might as well use them, but it's not worth investing any more in them. We're just going to use them until they finally break down, okay, and then we'll quit. that's what they did. They had 1950 to about 1980, 30 years, these mills made sugar. Okay, they never really made the profits that would have justified the original investment, but they made enough to cover their variable costs, so they kept them up. And then around 1980, the equipment's getting worse and worse. They start closing down the mills. So my feeling, well, my judgment is, okay, that the sugar industry in Taiwan, although it looks really important, as far as Taiwan's economic development is concerned, it was always kind of a sidelight. Okay, it wasn't as important as it often is seen, even though many people would look at that and they would say, wow, modernity has finally come to Taiwan. Look at those big sugar mills. Okay? But those sugar mills are not what really drove Taiwan's economic development. Okay? I think at best they were probably a break-even proposition.